It is a moment when the veil of everyday life lifts, opening a path into the world of ancient Greek legends and mythological tales. These timeless narratives, carefully preserved for millennia, have been passed down from generation to generation, retaining their pristine, almost tangible magic. They are like ancient echoes reaching us across the chasm of centuries, inviting a deep and peaceful immersion. We are invited to set aside all worldly concerns, allowing the day's hustle and bustle to slowly dissipate, like a weightless morning mist gliding over the serene expanses of the Aegean Sea. In this special hour, as the outside world falls silent, an imaginary journey begins into mysterious ancient Greece, a land where mighty gods freely walked among mortals, and every sea wave seemed to whisper unspoken ancient lore of bygone eras and great deeds. Imagine the Mediterranean Sea, captured on the most serene and tranquil morning one could envision. Its watery surface stretches endlessly, like a colossal, deep blue mirror, perfectly reflecting the sky, illuminated by the first rays of pre-dawn light. Not the slightest breath of wind dares to disturb this ideal, untouched surface. On the horizon, not a single sail is visible, only endless peaceful waters, warm, absolutely still, and enveloped in absolute calm, foreshadowing something great. Yet it was in this idyllic, as if frozen in eternity, tranquil scene that something truly extraordinary was about to unfold. An event that would forever and irrevocably alter the established order of the world for both the mighty gods dwelling on Olympus and the mere mortals inhabiting the earth. For the birth of the goddess Aphrodite was radically different from all previous births of the celestials. There were no thunderous proclamations from the majestic peaks of Olympus, no dramatic pronouncements echoing across the boundless heavens. Instead, her birth began with something wonderfully simple, almost imperceptible, and as gentle as ordinary sea foam, yet with the potential to transform all existence. The ancient Hellenes, passing down the wisdom of ages, told this story everywhere, at family dinner tables, in majestic temples, and undoubtedly as captivating bedtime tales. They sincerely believed that long ago, in those bygone times when the world itself was still young and the gods were just beginning to grasp their cosmic roles, the mighty Titan Cronus committed an act that seemed dictated by rage and despair, but ultimately led to the birth of the most beautiful goddess the universe had ever known. Cronus, it should be noted, found himself at the epicenter of incredibly serious family strife that shook the very fabric of the cosmos. His father, Uranus, the embodiment of the boundless and all-encompassing sky, constantly created unbearable problems for everyone around him, transforming into a cruel and intolerable tyrant. Having exhausted all patience, Cronus, tormented by his parents' behavior, made the fateful decision to take radical measures. Armed with an enormous curved blade that gleamed with an ominous light, he confronted his progenitor. What followed might seem incredibly dramatic and even shocking to modern sensibilities, but it is necessary to remember that this was a time when gods resolved their disagreements with methods that now appear quite unusual, if not strange. In the course of this titanic struggle, Cronus managed to inflict grievous wounds upon his father, and a portion of Uranus's divine essence, flowing with radiant energy, cascaded into the abyss of the sea, carrying within it the seeds of the future. It was at this moment, in the very heart of serene silence, that the true miracle began. The warm, still surface of the water suddenly started to shimmer, not from familiar sunlight, but from something far deeper, more mysterious and magical. The divine essence of the sky god Uranus mingled with the primordial waters, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, foam began to form on the surface. However, this was not ordinary sea foam that one might see on any coast. This foam emitted a soft internal glow, mesmerizingly swirling into perfect spirals, growing thicker and brighter with each passing moment. It gathered together as if guided by invisible but powerful hands, gradually forming a small, radiant island of white, pearlescent bubbles that began to drift silently across the calm, seemingly frozen sea. For many hours, this magical, glowing island of foam continued its unhurried drift across the boundless expanses of the Mediterranean Sea. Beneath it, in the blue depths, fish darted back and forth with curiosity, their scales catching and reflecting the strange, ethereal glow that the foam cast downwards. Above the surface, seabirds, as if guided by an invisible force, circled in the sky, instinctively sensing that something wondrous and inexplicable was occurring, though they could not fully grasp its true nature. The island of pearlescent foam silently glided past small Greek islands, where fishermen, mending their nets in the early morning light, sometimes looked up. They saw this shining patch on the water, but it was so dazzlingly beautiful and so utterly peaceful that they merely watched in reverent awe, not daring to disturb the majestic calm of this divine creation with their presence. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the world with golden light and warming the air, the magical foam began to transform. It slowly, almost gently, started to take shape, as if an invisible sculptor were working with the most delicate and ethereal materials. At first, in the white, shimmering bubbles, there was only a faint hint of the outline of something alive. Then, gradually, step by step, the clear contour of an elegant figure began to emerge, and then, at that very moment, which the ancient Greeks revered as the most beautiful instant in the entire history of creation, the foam parted like a curtain, revealing a perfect vision. Aphrodite, the goddess, stepped onto the serene surface of the sea. She appeared fully formed, perfect in every curve. Her long hair, the colour of molten gold, caught and amplified the sunlight, cascading in waves over her shoulders, and her skin seemed to glow with a soft, internal radiance. Her eyes were deep as the most uncharted ocean, and when she allowed herself to smile, the world around her, as if by magic, instantly transformed, becoming incomparably more beautiful. But what made this moment truly special was her demeanour. Aphrodite showed no trace of the confusion or shyness typical of a newborn creature. She stepped onto the water's surface with impeccable grace and confidence, as if she had walked on waves for all eternity. Gazing upon the calm sea, the boundless blue sky above, and the distant islands dotting the horizon, she instantly understood who she was and what her majestic destiny entailed. That the sea itself, like a living entity, immediately recognized her divine importance. Instead of swallowing her, the water's surface gently supported her feet, becoming firm like the earth beneath. Barely perceptible waves, as if by an invisible command, rose to create a shimmering path leading her to the nearest shore. From nowhere, as if by a magic wand, playful dolphins appeared, joyfully circling her in a welcoming dance, and the wind rose just enough to gently ripple her golden hair behind her as she effortlessly glided across the water. And as she moved, following her paths, flowers began to bloom in her wake. Of course, these were not real, earthly flowers, for she walked upon the sea, but the water itself seemed to blossom with unseen colours and new life wherever her foot touched. Pink and white petals woven from light and magic appeared on the surface, gracefully floating and swirling into mesmerizing, beautiful patterns, leaving behind a trail of divine presence. The first of the islands she reached was Cyprus, a place that from that immemorial moment became sacred to her and remained so for all time. As soon as her divine feet touched the golden sandy shore, the entire beach immediately transformed, as if by magic. Ordinary seashells scattered across the sand began to emit a soft inner glow, turning into purest pearls. Simple stones, smoothed by the waves, became incredibly smooth and astonishingly beautiful. Along the rocky cliffs, where only sparse shrubs had grown before, wild roses instantly bloomed, filling the air around with the sweetest, intoxicating fragrance that drifted far across the sea. The few islanders who came to the shore also instantly felt this inexplicable yet powerful influence. Couples, as if guided by an invisible force, found their hands involuntarily intertwining, and gentle smiles appearing on their faces. Children playing carelessly on the beach suddenly began to weave garlands for each other from the flowers that had appeared out of nowhere, their laughter becoming clearer and more joyful. Even the animal world seemed affected by this wave of harmony. Birds sang their songs sweeter and more melodiously, and cats, blissfully stretched out in the sun, purred with unprecedented pleasure. However, Aphrodite's journey through the world was just beginning. Her divine odyssey could not end on Cyprus alone. The same gentle waves that had carefully carried her to the shores of Cyprus now lifted her again, and she continued her triumphant movement across the Mediterranean Sea, visiting island after island, each ready to receive her blessing. Every place she touched instantly became more beautiful, filled with unseen love, harmony, and serenity. When she finally reached mainland Greece, something truly curious and significant occurred. The other gods, dwelling on majestic Mount Olympus and engaged in their daily yet all-encompassing affairs, suddenly, as if by an invisible signal, ceased their activities. Thunderer Zeus interrupted the dictation of another storm, his mighty voice falling silent. Wise Athena paused from her intricate weaving, her hands frozen above the loom. Apollo's lyre, usually incessant, fell silent for a moment, its melodic sounds dissolving into the air. All of them, the great Olympians, simultaneously felt it, a new, powerful presence in the world, something that was destined to change the entire cosmos. And they were, undoubtedly, right. Aphrodite's arrival in the world marked the birth of an entirely new, previously unseen kind of power, the all-encompassing power of beauty, profound love, and irresistible attraction. However, unlike some other gods who announced their presence with thunderous lightning, earth-shaking earthquakes, or raging storms, Aphrodite's power was surprisingly quiet, yet steadily growing and pervasive. It manifested itself through small, seemingly insignificant moments, a fleeting glance exchanged between strangers, the way sunlight suddenly made someone smile, incredibly radiant, or a suddenly arising, irresistible desire to pick a bouquet of flowers for a friend. The ancient Greeks sincerely believed that before Aphrodite's birth, love certainly existed, but it was more of a simple and practical necessity. People married for alliances, for protecting their families, and for mere survival. After her emergence from the sea foam, love transformed into something far more complex, sublime, and truly beautiful. It became the inspiration for poetry, the source of enchanting music, and the driving force for great art. It became the profound reason why people dared to travel across boundless oceans and wage great, fateful wars. In the days that followed her miraculous birth, Aphrodite explored her new world with insatiable curiosity, like someone seeing everything for the first time, absorbing every detail. She strolled leisurely through fragrant olive groves, running delicate fingers over the silvery green leaves, feeling their coolness and silkiness. She sat for long periods by clear springs and babbling brooks, observing her perfect reflection in the purest water, and understanding how even her fleeting smile could make the water itself shine brighter, filling it with vital energy. Soon she discovered with amazement that her presence had a profound and widespread effect on everything around her. Gardens bloomed with unprecedented lushness and abundance when she passed by. Young men and women became more graceful in their movements and more confident in themselves, their hearts filled with new hope. Artists found powerful, inexhaustible inspiration for their creations, their brushes moving with new vigour. Even the food at humble village feasts seemed, in some inexplicable way, to become tastier and more aromatic when she was near, bringing a piece of her divine radiance to every moment. But perhaps her most profound realization was the understanding that her gift was not limited to romantic love. Her pervasive influence helped people discover and appreciate all the multifaceted manifestations of beauty in the world, from the way morning light gently fell on a hillside, painting it in golden hues, to the pure, sincere sound of laughter shared between loyal friends, and the deep satisfaction that comes from work done well and with care. Eventually, the other gods, recognizing her undeniable greatness and unique power, invited her to majestic Mount Olympus, where she took her rightful place among the celestials. However, even there, in this realm of boundless divine power and colossal cosmic responsibility, Aphrodite forever remained inextricably linked to the sea that gave her birth. She often returned to the water's edge, especially in the quiet, early morning hours, to stroll leisurely through the light foam and relive that first, perfect moment when she first stepped into being, becoming the embodiment of love and beauty for the entire world. And the ancient Greeks held a deep belief that, with enough luck combined with exceptional silence and boundless patience, one might be granted a fleeting glimpse of her during her morning strolls. It was said that sometimes, as the sun was just beginning to rise and the sea was absolutely calm, one could spot a graceful figure gliding across the water, leaving behind a delicate trail of flowers and a soft glow. However, the true intrigue of this story lay not merely in the appearance of yet another powerful deity. Her birth marked the introduction of something entirely new and revolutionary into the world, the idea that beauty and love possessed the potential to be forces of change, comparable in their power to thunder, war, or even wisdom. Before Aphrodite's arrival, the pantheon of gods primarily governed the world through brute force, cunning trickery, or fear-inspiring might. It was she who demonstrated that gentleness and attraction could also move mountains, albeit acting more slowly and less visibly. A smile, it turned out, could achieve what a sharp sword could not. A single moment of beauty held the power to change an entire human life. And so, when we imagine Aphrodite taking her first steps from the sea foam onto solid ground, we witness the birth of a concept that profoundly influences us to this day. The understanding that love and beauty are not just pleasant additions to existence, but fundamental driving forces shaping our perception of ourselves and others. However, Aphrodite's story was just beginning, and the world of the Greek gods was about to plunge into even greater complexity. Speaking of complexities, has anyone ever wondered how a simple tree could determine the fate of an entire city? Imagine standing on a rocky hill in ancient Greece, gazing across the rolling landscape stretching to a distant, sparkling sea. The air is warm and dry, infused with the scent of wild herbs, seemingly presaging adventure. Below, a small settlement bustles with life. People go about their daily routines, completely unaware that their modest community is soon destined to become one of the most celebrated cities in the annals of human history. This is the narrative of how Athens received its name, and it all began with a rivalry between two gods, each vying for the same thing, to become the patron of this promising little city. The settlement did not yet have a name of its own. It was merely a cluster of dwellings, market stalls, and temples built at the foot of a high, flat-topped hill, now known as the Acropolis. The people who lived there were industrious and sharp-witted, the kind who could successfully make a home almost anywhere. However, they were well aware that for their city to grow and prosper, it needed divine protection. It was at this moment that Athena and Poseidon simultaneously decided they desired to take on this responsible role. Athena, you might remember, was the goddess of wisdom and war, the one born fully formed from Zeus's head. She was practical, thoughtful, and possessed an exceptional ability to solve problems. Poseidon, on the other hand, was the lord of the sea, earthquakes, and patron of horses. He was powerful, dramatic, and accustomed to getting his way. When both gods declared their wish to become the city's patron, its inhabitants found themselves in a rather delicate predicament. One could not simply refuse a deity without risking very unpleasant consequences. But having two patron gods was also impossible. It would be akin to trying to serve two masters, and everyone knew how successful that usually ended. So the city elders devised what seemed to them a fair solution, a competition. Both gods were to offer their gift to the city, and the people would choose which gift was more valuable. The one who presented the better gift would become their patron, and the city would be named in their honor. The day of the contest was clear and bright. Word of the impending event spread throughout the region, and people flocked from neighboring communities to witness this historic showdown. They gathered on the Acropolis, excitedly chattering among themselves and making friendly wagers on which god would prevail. Poseidon went first, likely because he was older and accustomed to deference. He strode to the highest point of the hill, raised his mighty trident, the three-pronged spear that served as his symbol, and struck it against the ground with colossal force. The earth trembled, rocks cracked and split, and from the spot where the trident struck, water began to gush forth, forming a spring right at the top of the hill. The crowd gasped and erupted in applause. Water was a precious commodity in this arid climate, and a reliable spring right in the heart of the city would be incredibly valuable. People could drink from it, water their animals, irrigate their crops during droughts. It was an impressive and seemingly very practical gift. However, then someone brave enough to taste the water from the new spring made a discovery that changed everything. The water was salty as the sea itself. Of course, salty water wasn't entirely useless. It could be used for cooking, for preserving fish, for some types of cleaning. But it couldn't quench thirst or water crops. Suddenly, Poseidon's gift seemed less practical and more a reminder of his power over the oceans. Nevertheless, it was an impressive display of divine might, and the crowd remained respectful as Athena stepped forward to make her move. Athena carried no trident or any other dramatic-looking weapon. She simply knelt, placed her hands on the rocky ground, and began to speak softly to the soil itself. Her voice was so gentle that only those closest to her could discern the words, and even then they couldn't quite grasp their meaning. For several minutes, nothing visible happened. Some in the crowd began to shift restlessly, wondering if Athena's gift would be as dramatic as Poseidon's spring. The sea god himself watched with growing confidence, believing that whatever his niece had planned could not rival his impressive aquatic display. Then, slowly, something began to push its way through the packed earth where Athena knelt. At first, it was just a tiny green sprout, barely visible among the rocks and dust. But, as everyone watched, mesmerized, it continued to grow and grow. Within minutes, it was a thin sapling. Within an hour, it was a young tree. By evening, it stood as tall as a man, with graceful branches and distinctive leaves that caught the light like silver coins. It was an olive tree, the first olive tree anyone in that region had ever seen. Now, to understand why this was such an astonishing gift, one must imagine what life was like for these ancient people. They subsisted mainly on bread, cheese, and any vegetables they could coax from the rocky soil. Meat was expensive and rare. Their diet was simple and often quite bland. Athena explained that this tree would bear fruit, small oval olives that could be eaten fresh or preserved in salt water. But even better, the olives could be pressed for oil, a golden liquid that would revolutionize their cooking, their lighting, and even their religious ceremonies. She demonstrated how olive oil could transform the simplest meal, making bread more flavorful and vegetables more satisfying. She showed how a wick floating in olive oil could provide a clean, steady light, far superior to smoky torches. She explained how athletes could rub the oil into their skin to keep it supple and healthy. But Athena's gift went deeper than just immediate practical applications. She told the people that olive trees were incredibly resilient and long-lived. Once established, a single tree could provide food and oil for generations. The trees grew even in poor soil and only improved with age, yielding more fruit over the years. Moreover, olive trees could be cultivated and expanded. One tree could provide cuttings to grow many more trees. An entire hillside could be transformed into an olive grove, providing wealth and sustenance for the entire community. When the people considered both gifts, the choice became clear. Poseidon's spring was impressive and demonstrated great power, but it solved only one problem, and not completely. Athena's olive tree was quieter and less dramatic, but it offered solutions to a multitude of problems, and would provide benefits for generations. The vote wasn't even close. The people chose Athena's gift, and their city became Athens in her honor. Poseidon, as one might imagine, was not a gracious loser. He retreated in a great rage, causing several minor earthquakes and stormy seas along the way. But his anger eventually subsided, and he came to respect both the wisdom of Athena's gift and the good sense of the Athenian people. And what became of that first olive tree? The Athenians treated it as sacred, building a special shrine around it and tending to it with the utmost care. They said that as long as the tree prospered, the city would prosper. In times of war, enemies sometimes tried to cut down the tree, believing they could weaken Athens by destroying Athena's gift. But the goddess had made her tree resilient. Even when it was cut to the ground, it sprouted again from its roots, growing back stronger than ever. For the people of Athens, the olive tree transcended being merely a source of sustenance and valuable oil. It transformed into a potent symbol, embodying their profound convictions, the supremacy of wisdom over crude might, foresight over immediate gratification, and peaceful development over aggressive conquest and domination. Olive branches soon attained the status of a universal symbol of peace throughout Hellas. Victors in athletic contests were honoured with wreaths woven from olive leaves placed upon their heads. Newlyweds entering into marriage carried olive branches with them, symbolising harmony and fertility. Diplomats arriving to conclude important agreements also held olive branches, underscoring their peaceful intentions. Thus, the flourishing olive oil industry brought to life the prediction of the goddess Athena, making the city of Athens not only wealthy, but also exceedingly prosperous. Athenian olive oil quickly gained recognition and fame across the Mediterranean due to its outstanding qualities and unique taste. Ships arrived from the most distant harbours, specifically to trade their goods for Athenian olives and oil. Along with commercial cargo, they brought new ideas and diverse cultural influences, which significantly contributed to Athens' transformation into a celebrated centre of learning and fine arts. The wealth accumulated through the cultivation of olive trees played a key role in funding grand construction projects, establishing educational institutions and supporting artistic initiatives that brought Athens worldwide renown. Thus, the magnificent Parthenon, that splendid temple which still proudly stands atop the Acropolis, was erected, among other things, with funds derived from olive oil exports. However, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this ancient legend is that it reveals to us the depth of the ancient Greeks' understanding of wisdom and effective governance. They clearly recognized that truly the best decisions are often not the most spectacular or dramatic. Athena's modest gift, just one olive tree, ultimately brought far greater benefit than Poseidon's grandiose and impressive display of power. The olive tree became the embodiment of the mindset that later glorified Athens. Cautious, deeply thoughtful, aimed at long-term advantages rather than an instant flashy result. It was this wisdom that subsequently gave the world such fundamental concepts as democracy, philosophy, theatre, and the foundations of scientific knowledge. Even today, many millennia later, olive groves continue to flourish on the hills surrounding Athens. Some of these trees, according to tradition, are direct descendants of Athena's original gift. Their gnarled, ancient trunks and shimmering silvery green leaves serve as a living link between the modern metropolis and its deep, ancient roots. A visitor to Athens can still see olive trees clinging to the slopes of the Acropolis, their branches seemingly reaching towards the majestic Parthenon towering above them. On quiet evenings, when the noisy streams of tourists dissipate and the city descends into serene twilight, It is almost possible to imagine Athena herself strolling leisurely among these ancient trees, surveying her gift and smiling at how fruitfully it served the people who, so many centuries ago, chose wisdom over ostentatious grandeur. The gift of the olive tree continues to bear fruit generously, season after season, year after year, generation after generation, exactly fulfilling the promise of the goddess Athena. However, Athens was not the only Greek polis whose history abounded with captivating narratives. On the contrary, some of the most fascinating tales originate from times when the Hellenes gathered not to dispute divine favour, but to compete with each other in a spirit of noble rivalry and striving for excellence. In the western part of Greece stretched a wide, grassy valley, surrounded by gentle hills dotted with olive trees and wild herbs. The morning sun cast long shadows over this landscape, and the air here literally vibrated with anticipation and universal excitement. This was Olympia, and on this momentous day, as ancient legend has it, the very first Olympic Games were to begin. The calendar marked 776 BC, although the people gathered there, of course, did not operate with such time frames. For them, it was simply an extraordinary summer, filled with the feeling of something new and truly wondrous. Athletes from numerous city-states across Greece flocked here, sometimes travelling for weeks, to participate in a competition unlike any the world had yet seen. But how did it all begin? Like many Hellenic traditions, this story originates among the gods, specifically with Zeus, the lord of Olympus, and his father, Cronus. It should be noted that Zeus did not gain kingship over the gods by right of inheritance or by vote. He had to win this position, literally entering into a fierce battle with his father, Cronus, for supremacy over the entire universe. It was a grand, epic battle that shook the very foundations of heaven and earth. And when Zeus finally emerged victorious, he decided to immortalize his triumph by establishing games in Olympia, a place especially sacred to him. However, Zeus, despite his sometimes very dramatic tendencies, was also a wise ruler and did not wish these games to serve solely as a celebration of his personal victory. His true desire was to reveal the best qualities in mortals, their physical strength, astonishing speed, unwavering courage, and supreme athletic prowess. Therefore, he issued a decree that every 4 years athletes from all corners of Greece were to gather in Olympia to compete in his honour. Imagine one of those first athletes arriving in Olympia for this grand competition. He had trained for many months, and perhaps many years, carefully preparing his body and mind for this fateful moment. He practiced running tirelessly until his legs felt they could carry him to the very ends of the earth. He lifted heavy stones and threw javelins until his muscles memorized every movement by heart. The first thing that struck one upon arrival was how different Olympia was from any other place. There was something special in the air, a sense of sacred purpose that gave even the most mundane activities an exceptional character. Other athletes arrived, and instead of seeing them solely as opponents to be vanquished, one felt genuine curiosity about their training methods, their hometowns, their personal stories of how they came to be there. This was because Zeus established something truly revolutionary during the Olympic Games. All hostilities between Greek polis were to cease entirely. It did not matter whether a particular city-state was in the midst of a fierce conflict with a neighbour. When the Olympic truce came, all parties laid down their weapons and instead focused on peaceful competition. The Olympic truce was observed with incredible seriousness. Military units literally stopped fighting in the middle of battles to ensure athletes' safe passage to Olympia. Sea raiders refrained from attacking ships carrying participants. Even the sharpest political disagreements were set aside for the entire duration of the Games. As the athletes settled into the designated area, they began to learn the rules and ancient traditions that would govern these first competitions. Everything was meticulously planned to ensure maximum fairness and deep reverence for the gods. All participants had to be free-born Greek men. Slaves, foreigners, and those convicted of serious crimes were barred from participation. Each athlete had to take a sacred oath to Zeus, promising to compete honestly and train diligently for at least 10 months. On the night preceding the start of the competitions, the athletes joined a solemn ceremony, illuminated by the flickering light of torches. All proceeded to the majestic altar of Zeus, where priests performed the sacrifice of a magnificent boar in honor of the king of the gods. Each participant placed a hand on the altar and recited the sacred Olympic oath. I will compete with honor, I will not cheat, and I will respect my opponents. With the arrival of dawn, the Games opened with the simplest and at the same time most fundamental of all competitions, the stadion race. This sprint, a distance of about 200 meters, was roughly equal to the length of the stadium. The significance of this race was so great that the entire Olympic festival was named after its winner. These first Games were to go down in history forever as the Olympic Games named after the triumphant. 20 men took their positions at the starting line, marked by grooves carefully carved directly into the stone slab. There were no starting blocks, nor specialized running shoes. Only bare feet touched the packed earth and sand. The starter did not use a pistol or whistle. Instead, he simply dropped a bronze disc, and its metallic clang served as the signal to begin the race. The runners burst from the start, their feet rhythmically pounding the track. Spectators, positioned on the grassy slopes that served as natural grandstands, cheered them on enthusiastically. However, there was something more to this cheering than just supporting one athlete over another. There was a deep sense that everyone gathered was witnessing a historic event, destined to become a tradition capable of outliving their own lives for many centuries. The winner of that first stadion race was a man named Koroibos, a humble cook from the nearby city of Elis. One can only imagine his astonishment when he was overnight transformed into the most famous man in all of Greece. However, his triumph was celebrated not only for his exceptional speed, but also because he embodied the Olympic ideal, an ordinary man who trained diligently and competed with unwavering honor. In the following days, new events were added to the competition program. Among them was wrestling, where athletes carefully covered their bodies with olive oil and sand for better grip, then aimed to throw each other to the ground 3 times. Wrestling matches were intense but maintained an atmosphere of deep respect. When one wrestler prevailed, he invariably helped his opponent up, and they embraced before parting ways. The pentathlon was a comprehensive test, challenging athletes in 5 different disciplines: running, long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, and wrestling. This competition was specifically designed to identify the most versatile athlete, a person who would fully embody the Hellenic ideal of harmonious excellence in all aspects. Of particular interest was observing the long jump, as ancient athletes performed an element not used by modern jumpers. They held weights in their hands during the jump. These stone or metal weights, known as halteres, were swung forward at the moment of takeoff and then sharply pulled back during landing, which was believed to help the jumper achieve significantly greater distance. Discus throwing as a sport possessed a unique aesthetic. Athletes, like virtuoso dancers, performed graceful rotations within a perfect circle, accumulating kinetic energy in their bodies before releasing the heavy bronze implement with incredible power. Masters of this art demonstrated a seeming effortlessness, creating the impression that the discus launched itself from their hands and landed a significant distance in the field. However, perhaps the most thrilling spectacle remained the chariot races, held at the Hippodrome, a long, narrow track framed by sharp turns at each end. Teams of 4 horses thundered around the track with deafening noise, their charioteers standing in miniature 2-wheeled chariots, desperately fighting for control over their animals, navigating the treacherous curves where the outcome of the entire competition was often decided. Chariot races carried significant danger, and frequent crashes and falls were commonplace. Nevertheless, a curious rule existed: if a charioteer was thrown from his chariot, but his horses continued to run and reach the finish line, he was still entitled to be declared the winner. The ancient Greeks, it seems, understood that sometimes triumph comes not from absolute control over a situation, but from the ability to set things in motion and trust in the will of fate. Against the backdrop of all these contests, something truly amazing unfolded among the audience. People who, in ordinary life, might have been implacable enemies, Athenians and Spartans, Thebans and Corinthians, unexpectedly found themselves sitting side by side, sharing food and wine, engaging in good-natured arguments about the chances of their favourite athletes, and discovering that they had far more in common than they had initially assumed. Thus, the games transcended mere athletic competition. They became a true celebration of the Greek spirit, a demonstration of shared values and culture capable of overcoming the political boundaries that typically divided city-states. In between the main events, other activities took place that later became integral Olympic traditions. Poets recited their fresh works, praising the valour of athletes and the greatness of the gods. Artists offered elegant bronze statuettes of runners and wrestlers for sale. Food vendors treated hungry spectators to roasted meat, fresh bread, and aromatic wine. However, the most significant tradition remained the victory ceremony. The victors of those ancient games were not awarded gold medals. That was a much later invention. Instead, their heads were crowned with wreaths woven from branches of the sacred olive tree that grew in the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. These olive wreaths, known as kotinos, were considered priceless, as they symbolized divine blessing and eternal glory. The victory ceremony itself was deeply moving. The winner stood on a simple platform, while a herald solemnly announced his name, his father's name, and his hometown to the gathered crowd. Then the olive wreath was placed on his head, and all present, fellow athletes, spectators, officials, unanimously joined in singing a hymn to Zeus. Nevertheless, the true rewards for an Olympic victory came after the games concluded, when the triumphant returned to their hometowns. Olympic champions became genuine celebrities. They were granted free meals for life, the best seats in theatres and at festivals, and sometimes even magnificent statues were erected in their honor. Poets competed to write victory odes praising their outstanding achievements. Even more importantly, Olympic champions were believed to receive special favor from the gods. People believed they would have great fortune in their affairs, their families would be healthier, and their lives would be longer. Some cities even claimed that having Olympic champions among their citizens served as protection against natural disasters and military defeats. As these first Olympic Games drew to a close, athletes and spectators gradually began to realize that they had become participants in something that would outlast them all. They had established a tradition that would gather Greeks every 4 years, reminding them of their shared heritage and values, even when political differences sought to divide them. The Olympic flame, burning unquenchably throughout the Games, was solemnly extinguished on the final day. However, the spirit of Olympia did not die with the flame. Athletes returned to their hometowns, carrying with them stories of new friends, techniques mastered, and the incredible feeling of competing at the highest level. And they immediately began training for the next Olympic Games, scheduled for 4 years later. For now they knew what was possible when Greeks gathered not to fight, but to celebrate the best of human achievement. Over the centuries that followed, the Olympic Games continued to evolve and transform. New sports were added to the program. The facilities became increasingly grand, and the competitions even more intense. However, the core values established at these first Games, the pursuit of excellence, fair play, peaceful competition, and respect for both gods and opponents, remained unchanged. Even today, watching the modern Olympic Games, we witness the continuation of traditions that originated in this peaceful valley of ancient Greece, when a group of athletes decided to honor the gods by showing the world what people can achieve when they dedicate themselves to becoming the best versions of themselves. The Olympic Games clearly demonstrated what Greeks could achieve when they came together in peace and friendship. But what happened when that same competitive spirit was directed toward the serious business of preparing for war? Imagine stepping into the most famous military mess hall of the ancient world. The sun slowly sets behind the mountains of southern Greece, casting long, wavering shadows across the simple stone building where Spartan warriors gathered each evening for their communal meal. A quiet murmur of conversation fills the air, and the scrape of wooden spoons against clay bowls can be heard. However, there is something entirely different about this place. This is not just dinner. It is a daily ritual that helped sustain one of the most disciplined societies in human history. Welcome to the Spartan Sicilian, the mess hall where grown men, capable of conquering entire armies, sat down each evening to share the simplest, most deliberately unappetizing food imaginable. The mess hall itself was exactly what one would expect from the Spartans. Functional, devoid of any ornamentation, and built to last centuries. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the room, scarred with decades of heavy use. Simple benches served as seats. There were no cushions, no tablecloths, no decorative plates, no flowers. The only light came from oil lamps, cast in flickering shadows on the stone walls. About 15 men gathered at each table. This number was not due to any magic, but because that was how many warriors typically fought together as a unit in battle. These were not just dining companions, these were brothers in arms who would depend on each other when the fighting began. As you take your place at one of these tables, the first thing you notice is the striking quietness compared to mess halls in other Greek cities. In Athens or Corinth, A similar meal would have been filled with loud conversation, laughter, sharp political debates, and philosophical discussions. Here, men spoke in low voices, and when someone did speak, others listened intently before responding. The meal began the same way every evening, year after year, generation after generation. A servant, usually a young boy still in training to become a full warrior, would bring in a large clay pot filled with the evening's main dish, the black broth. This black broth, incidentally, was legendary throughout Greece, though not in the most flattering sense. Other Greeks told anecdotes about it. They claimed that once you tasted Spartan black broth, you finally understood why Spartans were so eager to die in battle. Death might very well be preferable to another bowl of this concoction. But what exactly was this infamous black broth? The recipe was surprisingly simple. Pork, preferably the cheapest cuts, was boiled in water with salt, vinegar, and pig's blood until all the ingredients broke down into a thick, dark liquid. That was it. No herbs, no vegetables, no spices to enhance its flavour in the slightest. Just protein, salt, and calories delivered in the most efficient way possible. The broth was served in simple clay bowls, the same ones used for decades. Each man received exactly the same portion. There were no larger servings for senior officers, no smaller portions for younger soldiers. Everyone ate the same thing in the same quantity. Along with the black broth, a piece of dark bread was served, baked from barley flour and prepared without honey, nuts, or other ingredients that might improve its taste. The bread was dense and filling, intended solely to provide energy for the next day's training. Nothing more. There might also be a small piece of cheese, olives, or occasionally some fish, but these were considered luxuries. Black broth and barley bread formed the basis of every meal, every day. As one brought the first spoonful of black broth to their lips, they began to understand why this meal was so fundamental to Spartan society. It wasn't about the food itself at all. It was about what the food symbolized. First, there was the aspect of equality. When everyone ate the same thing, it reinforced the idea that no Spartan was more important than another. The wealthiest citizen, who might own vast estates and hundreds of slaves, sat next to a man of modest means, and both ate identical bowls of the same simple broth. This equality extended beyond the food. Men were required to contribute equally to the cost of these communal meals, paying a monthly fee that covered the ingredients and preparation. If someone couldn't afford their share, other members of their group would help them, as no one could be excluded from these essential gatherings. Deeply rooted in the Spartan way of life, the second noteworthy aspect is discipline. The daily, unquestioning consumption of the same simple food, without the slightest complaint or request for variety, served as a unique training for the mind, preparing it to endure hardship without losing focus. If one is capable of being content with humble black broth, even when able to afford far more exquisite dishes, then one is undoubtedly ready to stoically bear the privations and dangers inherent in military campaigns. However, perhaps the most significant element of all was cohesion. Sharing this deliberately unappetizing food together created a unique form of brotherhood. Everyone sitting at the table made the same small sacrifice, accepted the same minor inconvenience, participated in the same ritual of self-denial. And it truly was a ritual, not just a meal. The black broth was served in a strict order, starting with the oldest man at each table. Before anyone began to eat, there was a moment of solemn silence. dedicated to honouring the gods and remembering fallen comrades. Only after this brief but significant ceremony did the meal itself begin. Conversation during the meal also followed its own unwritten rules. Men might exchange opinions on the day's training exercises, share valuable advice on weapon maintenance, or discuss effective combat techniques. They might talk about the latest news from other parts of Greece, assessing potential threats or emerging opportunities. Sometimes they shared stories of famous battles or legendary Spartan heroes whose exploits served as examples. However, philosophical debates, so beloved by Athenians, or artistic discussions popular in other cities were never heard at these tables. A Spartan dinner was a practical conversation, entirely focused on matters directly related to their main task, being the best warriors. One aspect that invariably surprised visitors was the abundance of subtle, understated humour that permeated these conversations. Spartans were not gloomy, joyless people, despite their established reputation for seriousness. They simply preferred dry and laconic humour. A man might gracefully joke about some training mishap or make a witty comment on political events in Athens, but it always happened in the characteristic Spartan manner, brief, clever, and never distracting from more important matters. This particular style of humour even earned its own name, laconic speech, named after Laconia, the region where Sparta was located. Laconicism meant using the fewest possible words to express one's thought, and Spartans elevated this to an art form. The most famous example of laconic speech involves King Philip of Macedon, who sent a message to Sparta stating, "If I invade Laconia, I will drive you out." The Spartans' entire reply consisted of a single word, "if." Philip, it seems, took note and decided not to invade. As the meal continued, an observer would notice how attentively everyone listened when someone spoke. In other cities, table conversation often involved several people talking simultaneously, interrupting each other, vying to be heard. Here, when someone had something to say, everyone else gave them their full attention, and when they finished, there might be a moment of thoughtful silence before anyone responded. This was not because Spartans were naturally quiet people. It was a consequence of being taught from childhood to carefully consider every word before speaking it, and to listen respectfully when others spoke. These skills were critically important for soldiers who needed to communicate clearly and execute orders precisely in the chaos of battle. The meal itself did not last long, perhaps 30 or 40 minutes from start to finish. However, it was not intended for social interaction, like dinners in other cities. It was a working meal, a time for practical exchange of information among men who would soon have to trust each other with their lives. After everyone had finished their black broth and bread, a small cup of wine might be served, but even this was carefully rationed. Spartans believed that a little wine helped men relax and communicate more freely with each other. However, too much wine led to careless talk and poor judgment. So each man received exactly one small cup, mixed with water according to traditional Greek custom. As the evening drew to a close, conversation gradually subsided, transitioning into a comfortable silence. Some men might linger to discuss specific military matters with their closest comrades. Others would go home to their families or return to their barracks, depending on their age and marital status. But before anyone left the meal, a final ritual was performed. The oldest man at each table would offer a brief prayer of thanks, not for the food, which everyone acknowledged was not particularly enjoyable, but for the opportunity to share another meal with brothers who were willing to die for each other if necessary. Stepping out into the cool evening air, one would understand that they had witnessed something unique in the ancient world. Most societies used lavish feasts to display wealth and status. The Spartans, however, used deliberately simple food to build unity and discipline. Most cultures celebrated diversity and individual expression through food. The Spartans used identical dishes to emphasize their shared identity and common purpose. Most people viewed a meal as an opportunity to indulge and enjoy themselves. The Spartans, however, saw it as another form of training, another opportunity to practice the self-discipline that made them almost invincible in battle. This system of communal meals continued throughout a Spartan man's adult life. From the moment he became a full citizen at age 30 until he was too old to fight, he was required to take his main meal in the mess hall with his military unit. Men who missed too many communal dinners without good reason could actually lose their citizenship. That's how important this ritual was to Spartan society. Even when Spartans travelled to other cities, they often brought their own food with them, so as not to risk acquiring a taste for more luxurious cuisine. There are stories of Spartan ambassadors politely declining lavish banquets offered by foreign dignitaries, preferring to eat their simple bread and broth in solitude. And what about Spartan women? They did not participate in these male military meals, but they had their own traditions of simple, practical eating. Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for their physical fitness and strong character, qualities supported by a diet that prioritized nutrition and health over pleasure and indulgence. The tradition of black broth continued for centuries, becoming one of the most distinctive features of Spartan culture. Even when Sparta's military power eventually declined, and the city became less important in Greek politics, visitors still came to observe the famous communal meals and taste the legendary terrible broth. Some of these visitors left with a deeper understanding of what made Sparta so formidable for so long. It wasn't just their military training, their weapons, or their tactics. It was their willingness to sacrifice individual pleasure for collective strength, day after day, meal after meal, year after year. Black broth transformed into a symbol of something much greater. The idea that true strength stems from discipline, that genuine unity requires shared sacrifice, and that the strongest bonds are forged not in luxury and comfort, but in choosing to endure minor hardships together. Spartans built their strength through discipline on land. However, other Greek cities found their power in conquering the sea, and no maritime achievement was as impressive as the ships that seemed never to rest. Imagine the harbour of Piraeus as the first ray of dawn touches the water. The Mediterranean Sea stretches endlessly to the horizon, its surface disturbed only by gentle waves that catch and scatter the early sunlight. But this is not the peaceful scene of a fishing village one might imagine. This harbour teems with activity even at this early hour, because Athens had built the most powerful fleet the world had ever seen. And this fleet demanded constant, meticulous attention. At the centre of all this maritime activity was one of the most remarkable ships ever created, the trireme. Long, narrow, and built for speed rather than cargo, these vessels represented the cutting edge of ancient naval technology. But more than that, they represented an entirely new way of thinking about sea power and what it meant to control the waters. The name trireme comes from the 3 rows of oars that gave these ships incredible speed and maneuverability. Imagine a vessel about 36 meters long, but only 5.5 meters wide, roughly the proportions of a racing shell, yet large enough to hold 170 men. It was this unusual shape that made the trireme so effective in battle and so demanding to operate. But let us board one of these ships and see what daily life was like for the people who made Athens' naval power possible. When one first steps onto the deck of a trireme in the pre-dawn hours, their gaze involuntarily notes the striking crampedness, despite the vessel's impressive dimensions. Free space was virtually non-existent. Every inch of the ship was meticulously designed, serving a specific purpose, and every surface bore the imprint of continuous, intensive use. 170 rowers, whose combined might propelled this maritime giant, had already taken their places, though the sun's rays were barely beginning to break through the horizon. These individuals were not slaves, chained to their benches as Hollywood films sometimes depict. They were full Athenian citizens, many of whom took deep pride in their rowing skill and their invaluable contribution to the defense of their native city. The rowers were arranged on 3 levels, each with its own characteristics and requirements. The Thranites on the upper level, the Zygites in the middle tier, and the Thalamites at the very bottom, in the bilge. Each of these levels demanded its own rhythm of work and faced unique challenges. The rowers on the upper level wielded the longest oars, executing the most complex and sweeping strokes. Those on the lower level worked in extremely confined conditions, but their oars were shorter and, consequently, more manageable. What was truly astonishing was how these 170 individuals synchronized their movements to propel the ship across the water. There were no steam engines or diesel motors here, only pure human muscular power applied with striking precision and synchronicity. When each rower worked in perfect unison, the trireme could reach speeds of up to 9 knots, which was fast enough to effectively ram and sink enemy ships, or to swiftly escape dangerous situations. The coordination required was truly outstanding. The Kelaousts, or rowing commander, set the overall rhythm with his strong voice, and sometimes with strikes of a wooden mallet against the hull. Pull, 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 his cry echoed throughout the ship. And at that very instant, all 170 oars had to simultaneously plunge into the water to avoid a chaotic entanglement that could immobilize the vessel. But why did this ship never stop? Why was it constantly in motion? The answer lay in Athens' strategic position. The city's power depended entirely on full control of the sea lanes through which vital grain was brought from Egypt, timber from Thrace, and various luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. If enemies could cut these supply lines, Athens would inevitably face starvation. This is why Athenian triremes patrolled the seas continuously, day and night, regardless of weather conditions. A single trireme could spend weeks at sea, with crews rotating to ensure round-the-clock movement of the vessel. During daylight hours, the full crew worked at maximum efficiency, covering significant distances and proudly displaying the Athenian flag to both merchants and potential adversaries. At night, a smaller crew maintained a steady but more economical pace, ensuring the ship's continuous motion. This constant movement served several key purposes. It allowed one trireme to patrol a much larger area than would be possible if it anchored every night. Furthermore, it kept the crew in excellent physical condition, as trireme rowing was considered one of the most demanding physical exertions ever devised by man. Finally, this constant movement sent a powerful psychological signal to all who saw the ship. Athens never rests, never lowers its guard, never gives enemies the slightest chance to strike. Life on a constantly moving trireme demanded meticulous organization. Food was simple and eaten in shifts: bread, cheese, dried fish, and watered-down wine that would not spoil in the Mediterranean heat. There was no galley in the modern sense, only a small area where food could be prepared without creating a fire hazard on a wooden ship. Fresh water was precious and carefully rationed. Each person received a measured amount daily, enough to prevent dehydration, but absolutely insufficient for any waste. At the first opportunity, the ship would put into friendly ports to replenish water supplies. However, during wartime or in hostile waters, water conservation became a matter of life and death. Sleeping arrangements were equally challenging. There were no individual bunks or private cabins on a trireme. Resting rowers positioned themselves wherever they could find a bit of free space, usually curled up next to their oars or in small niches between equipment storage. The ship never stopped rocking with the movement of the waves, so everyone learned to sleep while constantly in slight motion. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of trireme operation is the maintenance routine that kept these complex machines in perfect working order day after day. It is important to remember that there were no spare parts available in the open sea, no marine supply stores, no emergency repair services. Everything had to be maintained with the tools and materials on board. Each evening, as the day shift handed over their duties to the night shift, crew members conducted a thorough inspection of every critical component. Oars were checked for cracks or splinters that could cause them to break during the next day's rowing. The leathern sleeves designed to protect the oar ports from seawater were examined and repaired if necessary. Ropes were carefully checked for wear, and any frayed sections were spliced or replaced. The ship's bronze ram that pointed metal beak at the bow, specifically designed to punch holes in enemy vessels, received special attention. It had to be kept clear of barnacles and seaweed that could reduce its effectiveness in battle. The ram was also the ship's most vulnerable point in bad weather, taking the full force of waves and potential collisions with floating debris. Navigation presented its own unique difficulties for a ship that never stopped. There were no GPS systems, electronic charts, or radio beacons to guide ancient mariners. Instead, navigators relied on their deep knowledge of the starry sky, coastal outlines, wind patterns, and sea surface conditions to determine their current position and course. During daylight hours, navigation was relatively straightforward, as long as the coast remained in sight. Experienced navigators knew every cape, every distinctive mountaintop, every harbour entrance along their patrol routes by heart. They could estimate speed by observing how quickly familiar landmarks passed by. But night navigation required entirely different skills. The navigator had to be able to accurately identify constellations and individual stars, understand how their positions changed throughout the night and across different seasons, and use this celestial information to maintain course, even when land was not visible. Weather added another layer of complexity to trireme operations. These ships were built for speed and maneuverability, not for weathering severe storms. When serious foul weather approached, the captain had to make a difficult decision: whether to seek shelter, potentially interrupting the patrol mission, or to continue sailing and risk damage to the ship and possible loss of the crew. Experienced trireme crews developed an almost uncanny ability to predict weather changes. They could read the wind direction, the color and behavior of clouds, how waves reflected light, and even the behavior of seabirds. All these signs gave them valuable clues about what weather was approaching and how severe it might be. However, storms were not the only danger faced by ships that never stopped moving. Pirates were active throughout the Mediterranean, and while they usually avoided attacking well-armed triremes, a vessel weakened by equipment failure or crew illness could present a tempting target for them. Most often, triremes encountered merchant ships in distress, ships damaged by storms, attacked by pirates, or simply lost and running low on supplies. The trireme's mission required assisting these ships when possible, both for humanitarian reasons and to maintain good relations with the merchants whose trade ensured Athens' prosperity. These rescue operations could be complex for a ship designed solely for military purposes. Triremes carried very limited extra supplies and had no space for additional passengers. Assisting a merchant ship might mean sharing precious fresh water, providing an escort to the nearest safe harbour, or sending a few crew members to the damaged vessel to help with repairs. Communication between ships relied entirely on visual signals during daylight hours. Flags, pennants, and standardized hand gestures allowed trireme crews to exchange basic information with other vessels, identification, destination, whether assistance was needed, warnings about pirates or approaching storms. At night, communication became much more difficult. Oil lamps could be used for simple signals, but only over short distances and in calm weather. More often, ships operating at night maintain, so to speak, radio silence, avoiding any signals that might reveal their position to enemies. The physical demands of trireme service were extraordinary by any standards. Rowing at full speed for hours required a level of strength, stamina and cardiovascular fitness that would impress even modern athletes. But it wasn't just about brute force. Technique was paramount. A skilled rower could sustain their stroke far longer than a stronger but less skilled rower. Crew members developed calluses on their hands that over time became like natural gloves, protecting them during long rowing sessions. Their shoulders and backs adapted to the specific movements required for trireme work, developing precisely the muscle groups needed for this arduous and responsible service. After many months or even years of such intense service, hardened veterans of the rowing teams could expertly manage their oars while simultaneously maintaining lively conversations, eating, or even allowing themselves a light doze. However, the most significant adaptation they manifested was psychological rather than purely physical. Existence on a constantly rocking ship, where one is never truly alone yet never achieves true solitude, demanded a special kind of resilience. The continuous readiness for sudden action forged a unique mental fortitude. Successful trireme crews achieved an almost telepathic understanding, subtly sensing each other's moods and needs. When the vessel finally returned to port after weeks spent at sea, the transition to land life could be quite abrupt. Crew members often complained of feeling unsteady on solid ground, having grown so accustomed to the continuous motion of the ship. The night's silence at home could seem alien and even frightening after weeks of falling asleep, to the monotonous sound of waves lapping against the hull, and the soft creak of wooden joints. It was these ships and their brave crews that were the cornerstone enabling a thriving Athenian democracy. The grain shipments from Egypt, the silver mined in Spanish mines, the exotic goods arriving from Black Sea colonies, all this wealth, which fueled Athens' golden age of art, philosophy, and politics, depended on triremes that seemed never to sleep, never to cease their patrols, never to give enemies the slightest chance to cut the vital sea arteries sustaining the city. But while Athenian triremes dominated the seas through tireless movement and vigilance, other forms of power in ancient Greece manifested themselves in an entirely different way, through immobility, deep contemplation, and the patient interpretation of divine will. A traveller might wander through the quiet, forgotten corners of ancient Greece, listen to the whispers of oracles, and observe the unhurried pace of daily life in remote settlements. Now their mind is invited to transport itself to another wonder, to a harbour where something majestic once stood, casting its grandiose shadow upon the gentle waves of the Mediterranean. Imagine standing on the rocky shores of Rhodes, an island that floats like a precious gem in the warm waters between Greece and Asia Minor. The year is roughly 280 BC, and before your eyes something unimaginable is taking shape. Piece by piece, a giant is born from bronze. The master's name was Haris of Lindos, and as tradition holds, he possessed the most patient hands imaginable. Each morning he awoke before the first rays of the sun, stretched his arms towards the lightening sky, and slowly made his way to his workshop. The scent of bronze and smouldering charcoal already hung in the air, mingling with the salty sea breeze from the harbour. The fact was, the people of Rhodes had just endured something terrible. For an entire year, their island had been under siege. Enemy ships surrounded them, like a pack of wolves circling their prey. But miraculously, they had emerged victorious. The attackers retreated, leaving their massive siege equipment on the beaches. What do you do when you're given a second chance at life? The Rhodians surveyed all this abandoned bronze and iron, and someone, perhaps Charis himself, voiced a crazy but brilliant idea. Let's build something so tall, so magnificent, that ships from across the Mediterranean will see it and know they have reached Rhodes. But here's what most people don't know about the Colossus of Rhodes. It wasn't built in a day or even a year. Its construction took a full 12 years. 12 long years Charis woke up, ate his modest breakfast of bread and olives, and went to work on the most ambitious project anyone had ever imagined. You can almost feel the weight of those years watching his tireless labour. Bronze is not clay that you can mould with your fingers. Bronze must be heated until it glows like a small sun, then poured into carefully crafted moulds. Every part of the Colossus, and there were thousands of them, had to be flawless. Charis began with the feet, massive bronze feet that would support a statue as tall as a modern 15-story building. He spent months just on the toes, making sure each one could bear the weight of what was to follow. The townspeople passing his workshop would peer inside, watching him polish the same bronze toe for the 100th time. Children grew up watching the Colossus grow. A little girl who was 5 when the project began would have been 17 by the time it was finished. Perhaps she brought Charis water on hot summer days, watching the sweat drip from his brow onto the bronze he was shaping. "Master Charis," she might ask, "why are you making it so big?" and Ceres, wiping his hands on his leather apron, would look out at the harbour, because, he might say, sometimes the world needs to see that beautiful things are possible, even after terrible things happen. The statue was not built where most people believe it was. Many have likely seen images of the Colossus straddling the harbour entrance, like a giant bridge with ships sailing between its legs, but that is merely a later story that grew like a weed in the garden of facts. The true Colossus stood on a hill overlooking the harbour, one hand shading its bronze eyes as it gazed out at the endless sea. It was Helios, the sun god, and each morning as the real sun rose, the statue's bronze skin caught the light and gleamed as if alive. Can one imagine what that must have looked like? 100-foot bronze figure, shining in the dawn light, looking out over the boundless sea. Sailors approaching roads would see that golden glow for many miles and know they were almost home. But building the Colossus was like trying to solve a puzzle no one had ever solved before. How do you create something so tall that it won't topple in a gust of wind? How do you lift such heavy bronze pieces without modern hoisting mechanisms? Ceres had to invent entirely new methods of working. He built the statue around a framework of iron rods and stone, like a skeleton inside a living body. Then he covered this skeleton with a bronze skin, piece by piece, rising from the ground. As the statue grew taller, Ceres had to build ramps and scaffolding around it. Eventually, the Colossus was surrounded by a small mountain of wooden platforms and earthen embankments. Workers lifted the bronze pieces up these ramps, like ants carrying crumbs to their nest. One can almost hear the sounds of construction echoing through the harbour, the clang of hammers on bronze, the creak of wooden blocks, the shouts of workers calling to each other across the scaffolding, and beneath it all, the constant whisper of waves against the shore. Of course, there were accidents. Bronze is heavy and heights are dangerous. Some workers fell, some pieces were cast incorrectly and had to be remelted and redone. There were days when Ceres probably sat on a rock by the harbour, wondering if this impossible dream would ever become a reality. His hair turned grey over those 12 years. His hands were forever stained with bronze dust. His back ached from bending over moulds and reaching to install pieces. But every morning he continued to come to work. The face was the most challenging part. How do you capture divinity in bronze? How do you make metal look like it is thinking, feeling, seeing? Ceres spent 2 full years just on the Colossus's head, crafting features that would look right from the ground 30 meters below. The eyes were especially difficult. They had to be large enough to be visible from the harbour, but they also had to look kind. Helios was not a fierce god, like Ares, or cunning like Hermes. He was the sun itself, steady, warm and reliable. Every day he drove his fiery chariot across the sky, bringing light to the world. So Ceres gave the Colossus eyes that seemed to smile slightly, eyes that looked out at the sea with patience and welcome. When sailors saw those eyes, they knew they were safe. Finally, after 12 long years, the creation was complete. The scaffolding was removed piece by piece, revealing the finished Colossus to the people of Rhodes. Can one imagine that moment? The whole city must have held its breath as the last wooden platform was removed, and their bronze guardian stood revealed in all its glory. The dedication ceremony lasted for several days. People came from all over the Mediterranean to see this wonder. They brought gifts and offerings not just to Helios, but to Chares himself. He had created something that seemed impossible, a bronze man tall enough to touch the clouds. But here's what makes one ponder about the Colossus. It stood for only 56 years. Just 56 years after Chares completed his life's work, an earthquake shook Rhodes and brought the great bronze giant crashing to the ground. 56 years? That's about the length of a human life in those days. All that work, all those dreams, all that bronze, and then one morning the earth trembled, and it was all over. The fallen Colossus lay by the harbour for another 800 years. Even broken and lying on its side, it was still a marvel. Tourists came from Rome just to see the massive bronze fingers and toes scattered along the shore. One great thumb alone was so large that most people couldn't get their arms around it. Chares did not live to see that terrible earthquake. His journey ended peacefully within the walls of his own workshop, surrounded by the miniature bronze sculptures he had created over the years. However, during his lifetime he had the opportunity to step outside each morning and gaze upon his audacious dream, towering against the sky and vigilantly watching over his native island. It is truly astonishing that Chares dedicated 12 years to erecting something he knew perfectly well would not last forever. Bronze corrodes. Earthquakes are inevitable. No creation of human hands can withstand eternity. Yet he built it nonetheless, for sometimes the very act of creating something magnificent transcends the question of its longevity. Nowadays anyone can visit Rhodes and walk through the places where the Colossus once majestically stood. The harbour is still as welcoming, still as beautiful, and invariably receives ships arriving from all corners of the Mediterranean. And although the bronze giant is no longer visible, there is still something special in the air, as if an echo of an impossible dream that, if only for a brief moment, nevertheless became a reality. As one falls asleep, one might ponder Chares, who diligently toiled in his bronze-infused workshop, creating something grand, detail by detail. What impossible dreams might come true if everyone had the patience to work on them for 12 years? What bronze giants, perhaps, lie hidden in the secret corners of one's own imagination? Thoughts have drifted around patience, bronze, and impossible dreams. Now let the mind transport itself further back in time, to an island where the very stones hold secrets from when the world was young, to a place where something beautiful turned into something terrifying, and where the line between myth and reality blurs like a mirage over ancient walls. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a small boat, approaching the largest island in the Greek seas. Crete rises from the blue waters like a sleeping giant, all golden hills, white cliffs, and hidden valleys that seem to whisper of forgotten times. The year might be 1450 BC, or it could have been yesterday. Time flows differently here. It was here that the Minotaur dwelled, in the heart of a labyrinth so intricate that even its creator could not find his way out. But before we delve into stories of monsters and mazes, let's talk about something else. The enchanting scent of saffron in the morning air, and the peculiar way light falls on an island that remembers being the centre of the world. For long before classical Greece, before philosophers in Athens or valiant warriors in Sparta, there was Crete. The Minoans, as we now call them, built something here the world had never seen. A civilization without walls. Wait, a civilization without walls. One should ponder that for a moment. Every other ancient city one can imagine was surrounded by massive stone barriers bristling with weapons ready for war. But the Minoan palaces on Crete had no defensive walls. Only open courtyards, vibrant frescoes, and rooms that seemed to flow into each other like water. Walking through the ruins of Knossos, the greatest of these palaces, one's footsteps echo in the corridors that may have inspired the legendary labyrinth. These are not dark, menacing passages. They are filled with light and colour. The walls are painted with images of dolphins frolicking in blue waves, ladies in exquisite attire, youths leaping over bulls in ceremonies whose meaning we can barely grasp. Bull leaping is a crucial detail. It appears on the walls everywhere you look, young people, both male and female, grasping the horns of massive bulls and vaulting over their backs, not killing the bulls, not fighting them, but dancing with them. But something happened here. Something that turned bull dancing into stories of monsters, that transformed a sophisticated civilization into a narrative of human sacrifice and subterranean horror. The question is, what was it? One might encounter an old archaeologist working among the ruins, his hands covered in dust from sifting through pottery shards older than the pyramids. He would explain that around 1450 BC, something catastrophic happened to the Minoans. Their palaces were burned, their writing disappeared, their peaceful artistic culture vanished almost overnight. But what caused it, you might ask, watching him brush dirt from a fragment of a fresco, depicting a young woman with intricate curls and perceptive eyes. He would pause his work and look towards the sea. Perhaps an earthquake, he might say. Perhaps a volcanic eruption on a nearby island. Perhaps invaders from the mainland. Perhaps all three at once. But something destroyed that world so completely that centuries later, people could only remember it as a myth. And this is where the Minotaur appears. Sometimes when something is too terrible to comprehend, the human mind transforms it into a story. The narrative of King Minos and his impossible labyrinth might have been the way later Greeks tried to make sense of these complex ruins, these corridors that seem to lead everywhere and nowhere. Delving into the restored palace, one begins to realize how the legend might have originated. The building truly resembles a labyrinth. Corridors turn back on themselves. Staircases lead to rooms that, in turn, lead to other staircases. Storerooms extend underground, like burrows. Without knowing the way, it would be easy to get lost for hours. The throne room makes an especially eerie impression. There stands a stone chair adorned with images of griffins, where someone once sat, making decisions that affected the entire Mediterranean. But the chair faces not the room where supplicants gathered, but a wall painted with other griffins. Why does the throne face the wall? Was the real power behind that wall in some hidden chamber we haven't found yet? Or did the king of Knossos listen to voices others couldn't hear? One sits quietly in this throne room as the midday light filters through windows 3,500 years old. The silence is so complete that one can almost hear the ghosts of ancient conversations, the rustle of ceremonial robes, the distant sound of bull dancers training in the grand courtyard. But there is something else in the silence, something that makes the hairs on one's arms stand slightly on end. Perhaps it's just the weight of all that history, all those vanished lives, or perhaps some echoes truly linger in the stone. The Minotaur in the tales was the son of a queen and a bull, monstrous, insatiable, demanding tribute from across the sea, 7 youths and 7 maidens, sent every 7 years to feed the beast in its underground lair. It is a grim story, full of fear, sacrifice, and hopelessness. But what if it began quite differently? What if the bull-leaping ceremonies of ancient Crete required young people to come from other islands for training and competition? What if some of them inevitably got injured or died in these dangerous displays? What if the tribute was actually an athletic recruitment, and the monster was the sacred bull itself? One ascends to the upper levels of the palace, where once enormous clay jars, tall enough for a person to hide inside, were stored. These jars held oil, wine, and grain, the wealth that made Minoan civilization possible. But in the strange light of late afternoon, they looked as if they could conceal other things, secrets, treasures, perhaps even people. The famous snake goddess figurines were found here, small statues of women holding snakes, their eyes wide and mysterious, their exquisite dresses incredibly detailed. Were they goddesses, priestesses, queens? We don't know, because we cannot yet read Minoan writing. Linear A, as it is called, remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Imagine having the records of an entire civilization, and you cannot read a single word. It is like finding a library where all the books are written in a code you cannot crack. The Minoans left us their art, their architecture, their pottery, but their voices remain silent. This silence, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing about Crete. Other ancient civilizations left us their stories, their laws, their complaints about taxes and the weather. The Minoans left us beauty, exquisite frescoes of flowers, dolphins, and dancing people, but not a single word to explain what it all meant. Walking through the Queen's chambers, where the walls are painted with dolphins swimming in underwater gardens, there is even an ancient flush toilet, more sophisticated than anything Europe would see again for 1,000 years. This was clearly a civilization that valued comfort, beauty, and cleanliness. So how did it become the setting for such a grim myth? Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the story of the Minotaur is not really about Crete at all. It is about what happens when something beautiful and complex is forgotten, and all that remains is the fear of the unknown. The hero Theseus in the myth killed the Minotaur and escaped the labyrinth with the help of Ariadne's thread. But what if the real thread was memory itself? What if the myth was ancient Greece's way of trying to find a path to understanding a civilization they could no longer comprehend? As the sun sets over Crete, one stands in the grand courtyard where bull dancers once performed their incredible feats. The mountains around Knossos turn purple in the evening light, and the air smells of wild thyme and sea salt. Somewhere in the distance, goat bells can be heard as the shepherd leads his flock home. This is still a living island, not just a museum. On Crete, in the very heart of an ancient civilization, human existence continues its eternal cycle. The descendants of modern inhabitants carefully cultivate olive groves, whose roots may reach back to the era when the last Minoan ruler sat on his throne, gazing upon the world. In villages built on foundations that preserve the memory of the Bronze Age, the carefree laughter of children still rings out. However, here, on this island, there is something unique in the very perception of time. Perhaps it is the oppressive weight of unsolved mysteries, countless unanswered questions. Or perhaps it is the phenomenon where ancient ruins seem to waver and shimmer in the heated air, as if they do not possess full materiality, not entirely dissolved into oblivion. This phenomenon is most acutely felt in moments of secluded silence, when a traveller sits in the throne room enveloped by antiquity, or walks through the storerooms where colossal jars cast bizarre shadows. Time here ceases to be a linear flow. Past and present seem to touch and coexist in the same space, separated only by the ephemeral thickness of the air. The Minotaur, if its existence was ever real, has long since vanished into legend, becoming part of myth. The labyrinth, if it ever represented a true, intricate structure, is now merely a collection of interconnected rooms where patient archaeologists tirelessly work and curious tourists wander. Nevertheless, a certain anticipation still lingers in this place. It seems to await the moment when someone will manage to solve the complex puzzle, decipher the ancient code, finally comprehend the true essence of events that occurred here so long ago. Perhaps it is this inexplicable allure that draws people back to Crete again and again, to continue excavating through layers of ancient ruins, persistently trying to piece together the tiniest fragments of frescoes and shards of pottery. This is not mere archaeological curiosity. It is a profound sense that somewhere an invisible thread still exists, a path that can be followed, capable of leading back to the very heart of what was once the labyrinth. As the traveller prepares to leave this island, where time flows like honey, a fascinating insight dawns on them. The myth of the Minotaur speaks of a state of being lost in a space designed to confuse. But the true Crete, the Crete of morning light caressing ancient stones and wind gently whispering through olive trees, represents something entirely different. It speaks of the patience required to painstakingly extract fragments of past beauty from what was destroyed centuries ago. It speaks of how mystery can sometimes be more alluring and profound than the most exhaustive answers. It reminds us that sometimes the most important things are those that are almost tangible in our memory, yet still elude us, remaining on the edge of awareness. And as one falls asleep, pondering goddesses with snakes, courageous bull leapers, and walls painted with unimaginable vibrant colours, one inevitably wonders, what myths will future archaeologists invent to explain the fragments of our own civilization? What monsters will they imagine to make sense of our ruins when time has passed? Let the imagination transport the reader to the deck of Odysseus's ship, where salty spray caresses the face as the vessel approaches something utterly unimaginable, an island hovering above the sea like a bronze shield, weightlessly balanced on the waves. The cliffs, rising directly from the abyss of the sea, strike with their smoothness and perfection, as if polished by gigantic hands, and encircle the entire island like a precious ribbon on a gift. It is a majestic wall of radiant bronze, reflecting the dazzling midday sun. The traveller has already wandered among ancient ruins and tried to unravel mysteries carved into stones that stubbornly remain silent. Now let their mind completely detach from solid ground, ascend like sea mist to a place that exists somewhere between earth and sky, where the mighty Lord of the Winds vigilantly watches over the world's breath. This is Aeolia, the floating abode of Aeolus, the mighty Lord of the Winds. But before the traveller meets the deity himself, it is worth contemplating what it means to be responsible for something as untamed and wayward as the wind. Each of the winds had its own name, its own temperament, and its capricious whims. Boreas, the north wind, was piercing and sharp, reliable and as unyielding as winter itself. Notus, the south wind, brought warmth and moisture, presaging storms. Zephyrus, the west wind, was gentle and fragrant, a true herald of spring's awakening. And Eurus, the east wind, was inscrutable and mysterious, bringing whatever weather suited its changeable nature. It is noteworthy that most people tend to perceive wind merely as moving air, something that arises spontaneously, devoid of consciousness or specific purpose. However, the ancient Greeks possessed a deeper understanding. They realized that wind is endowed with character, sometimes playful, sometimes fierce, and sometimes so gentle that it barely rustles the leaves on an olive tree. And it was Aeolus who kept them all under constant control. Imagine the responsibility the Lord of the Winds bears, ensuring that Boreas does not blow too strongly, turning fishing fleets into icy blocks, that Notus does not bring excessive rains and flood fertile fields, that Zephyrus arrives precisely on time to awaken the flowers from their winter slumber. It can be compared to conducting a symphony orchestra where each musician is invisible, powerful enough to sink ships or lift birds to dizzying heights, and yet has strong opinions about when and where they wish to play. The traveller begins the ascent up the bronze steps, winding along the rock face, and is struck by how they seem to respond with a melodic chime beneath their feet. Each step emits a slightly different tone, so that the climb to Aeolus's halls is like ascending a musical scale played on some colossal instrument. The palace itself is unlike anything they have ever seen. The walls, made of cloud-coloured marble, do not seem solid. They breathe as if alive, smoothly expanding and contracting like lungs. Windows appear and disappear before the observer's eyes, opening to let in gentle breezes from specific cardinal directions, and closing when these breezes have delivered their messages. And everywhere, the ceaseless chiming of wind bells can be heard. These were not simple bamboo ornaments one might hang on a porch, but intricately crafted constructions of bronze, silver, and some metal unknown on the earth below. They hang from every archway, dangle from every tree, and some float weightlessly in the air without visible support. The music they create constantly changes. Sometimes it is such a divine harmony that it can bring tears to one's eyes. At other times it is a sharp, dissonant clash that makes one want to cover their ears. But after a while the observer understands that this is not accidental. The wind bells engage in an unseen dialogue with each other, exchanging information about weather conditions across the Mediterranean, warning of approaching storms heading towards Africa, or announcing gentle breezes that help some merchant ship swiftly approach its home shores. As for Aeolus himself, to accurately describe his appearance is like trying to describe the wind itself. Sometimes he appears as a venerable old man with a beard that billows like morning mist. Sometimes he appears as a middle-aged woman whose hair seems woven from swirling air, and sometimes he appears as a youth whose features shift and flow like clouds scudding across the azure sky. He shows the traveller the heart of his palace, a circular room with a domed ceiling that reflects the sky overhead in real time. But it's not just the sky over Aeolia. As the observer watches, the ceiling changes to show weather conditions over Troy, over Egypt, over the western seas where no mortal ship has ever sailed. "Welcome," he cordially greets Odysseus and his companion. his words carried by a wind saturated with the scent of olive groves, echoes of distant snow, and the deep breath of the ocean. Welcome to the abode where all winds are born. Nevertheless, his voice remains constant. It sounds like the rustle of wind in pine trees, like sails filling with a favourable breeze, like the barely perceptible whisper of air at a cave entrance. When Aeolus speaks, the traveller perceives him not only with their ears. They feel his words caress their hair, make their clothes rustle, carrying with them echoes of a dozen different places. In the very centre of the room is something that strikes the imagination. It is a sphere, made of what appears to be crystallized air, floating weightlessly at about chest height and rotating rhythmically. Inside the sphere, continuous motion can be observed. Swirling, dancing, rapid patterns of silver, gold, and translucent blue. The observer, captivated, watches as the patterns within the sphere chase each other in intricate games. Sometimes they form spirals similar to seashells. At times they dance in pairs, intertwining like invisible birds. And sometimes they all rush to one side of the sphere, then suddenly scatter to fill the entire space with their restless energy. The wind's at rest, Aeolus explains, and in his voice are notes of paternal pride. When they are not needed elsewhere, they return to their abode to indulge in games. Wait, the observer realizes they are not just watching meteorological phenomena. These were genuine personalities, individual winds, each with its unique manner of movement, its preferred pastimes, its relationships with its brethren. It's like watching a family of invisible children at play. The moment Aeolus's fingers touch the crystallized surface of the sphere, the room fills with movement. Not furious or terrifying, but gentle, curious movement. Like a dozen unseen cats affectionately rubbing against one's legs and purring. The traveller's hair rises and falls, Their clothes flutter as if they are standing in a stream of the gentlest water. Aeolus notices their deep fascination. Would they like to get to know them better? He asks, and without waiting for assent, extends his hand towards the sphere. They see everything. Aeolus softly pronounces. Every sail, every bird, every blade of grass that bends to their breath. They are my invisible eyes and keen ears in the mortal world. And then the traveller hears them, not quite voices, but something very much like them. The north wind sounds like a distant rumble of thunder, low and authoritative, and a little grumpy, as if roused from a deep sleep. The south wind chuckles, like rain drumming on leaves, warm and mischievous. The west wind hums a gentle melody that makes one think of opening buds, of melting ice, of birds returning from a long winter journey. The east wind whispers secrets, things about storms forming in 3 days, things about a pod of dolphins frolicking in the waves off Sicily, things about a lonely lighthouse keeper who converses with the wind, for he has no other companion. Along the Anatolian coast, fishing villages depend on the gentle breath of the winds for their nets to dry in the sun. At the same time, a merchant ship, laden with precious grains, speeds towards Alexandria, trying to outrun the approaching first storm of the season. And in the mountainous expanses of Thessaly, a young shepherd carefully studies the characteristic features of wind patterns to accurately predict the most suitable grazing spots for his flock in the coming week. When one witnesses the labour of Aeolus, the Lord of the Winds, their expectations are quite different. He does not act as a commander, loudly issuing orders to his aerial legions. Instead, Aeolus spends long hours in deep concentration, listening intently. He sits in his transparent crystal chamber, with closed eyes, keenly sensing every report brought to him by the slightest breath of wind, as if each such breath is a messenger. For an entire month, Odysseus and his companions reside on this wondrous floating island. And indeed, it was a truly unforgettable month, filled with marvels. Each morning, awakening is accompanied by the gentle chiming of newborn wind chimes. It seems as if they sprout like exotic flowers in Aeolus's gardens, emerging from crystalline seeds of music that the winds carry with them from their endless wanderings. How do you manage to keep track of all this? One asks Aeolus one evening, watching the setting sun paint his bronze walls in deep copper hues. The Lord of the Winds feels absolutely everything, the needs and aspirations, the hopes and fears, as well as all the weather phenomena that continuously form and then dissipate across thousands of miles of boundless seas and vast continents. And in some incomprehensible, almost incredible way, he invariably finds ways to offer his assistance. Sometimes it is a gentle nudge, giving favourable winds an extra boost for a grain ship heading towards its destination. Sometimes it is a barely perceptible change in air currents, bringing dry air to a fishing village. And sometimes it is a warning whisper, reaching a shepherd, foretelling rain coming from a completely unexpected direction. Aeolus bestows a smile upon his interlocutor, and this smile, it seemed, was carried on a light breeze, filled with the delicate scent of jasmine. How do you track every beat of your heart? He replies with a question, adding, some phenomena penetrate so deeply into your essence that they cease to require conscious thought. However, a melancholic note is perceptible in his voice, something that makes one look at him more closely. For all his boundless power, for all the unearthly beauty of his floating island, and the crystal sphere filled with playful winds, Aeolus gives the impression of a deeply solitary being. He is inextricably linked to everything and everyone through his winds, yet he must remain apart, merely observing and listening intently, making only the finest, most precise adjustments from his airy home, situated somewhere between the boundless sea and the high sky. It is at this moment that a profound realization comes, something crucially important regarding the responsibility of managing powerful forces of nature. A person vested with such authority can never fully integrate into the world they are meant to protect. Aeolus, for example, cannot travel on ships, for his very presence would inevitably disrupt the natural course of the winds, so essential for these vessels' movement. He cannot stroll through mortal gardens as the flowers and trees would turn away from him in confusion, not understanding which way the wind should now blow. One watches as Aeolus meticulously ties this silver cord, and is struck by the incredible care with which he forms each knot. This is not merely a courtesy extended to an arriving hero. It is a genuine work of art, a tangible demonstration of his deepest understanding of how winds function, how they can be carefully contained and guarded and then released at the precisely determined, most opportune moment. Dare not open it until you reach your homeland, Aeolus warns, and in his voice, the unwavering weight of absolute power is palpable. And under no circumstances allow your men to untie it. The winds contained within possess enough power to carry you to the ends of the earth. When the time comes for Odysseus to depart, Aeolus bestows upon him a gift destined to become a central element of one of the most sorrowful and frustrating stories in all of Greek mythology. It was a leather bag, intricately tied with a silver cord, containing all the winds capable of blowing Odysseus's ships off course. Only the west wind was left free, so it could carry the hero directly home to the shores of Ithaca. However, instead of a predictable and calm journey, they encounter a furious hurricane. The previously captured winds roar out of their confinement, like wild, untamed horses howling with rage for their long captivity and rushing in all conceivable directions simultaneously. In a matter of moments, Odysseus's ships are thrown back to Aeolia, their sails torn to shreds, masts broken, and crews, exhausted and frightened to the extreme, are cast onto the bronze shores of the floating island. Aeolus merely glances at them and slowly shakes his head. The wind chimes that surround his palace begin to sound with a sad, piercing melody, playing a slow requiem for lost opportunities squandered due to human folly. And, of course, Odysseus's men do exactly what they were strictly forbidden to do. Barely are they within sight of Ithaca, with home so close after 10 years of wandering, when an irresistible curiosity overcomes them. They untie the silver cord while Odysseus sleeps soundly, naively expecting to find untold treasures inside the leather bag. As one sails away from Aeolia for the second time, they look back at the receding floating island, which gradually diminishes in size on the horizon. The bronze walls of its palace catch the morning sun's rays one last time, playing with reflections. The wind chimes perform a farewell melody that fades as they move further away, becoming increasingly indistinct. And slowly, but relentlessly, the island dissolves into the sea mist and becomes merely a part of memories. And that is all. No second chances are given, no more negotiations will take place. Odysseus and his exhausted companions are forced to push their damaged ships back into the water and continue their arduous journey, deprived of any help from the Lord of the Winds. "I cannot help you again," Aeolus says with deep sadness. "The winds you foolishly released because of your greed have told me everything. You are no longer under my protection." But what lingers in one's memory long after Aeolus's island finally disappears over the horizon is the indelible image of Aeolus in his crystal chamber, silently listening with infinite patience to the needs of the world he is capable of protecting, but to which he can never truly belong. It is the gentle sound of the wind chimes that seem to grow from unknown seeds of music. It is the mesmerizing sight of invisible winds playfully chasing each other within the sphere of crystallized air. And perhaps most importantly, it is the profound realization that some gifts, whether favorable winds, the chance of a second opportunity, or the trust of powerful forces beyond human comprehension, can only be granted once. That certain forms of assistance require not just gratitude, but deep wisdom, and that some kinds of power are too significant and responsible to be treated lightly. Tonight, listening intently to the wind that moves silently through the world outside the window, one might involuntarily ask deep questions. What messages does it carry? What careful and precise adjustments might someone be making somewhere between earth and sky, so that the necessary breezes reach the right places at precisely the right time? And what gifts, symbolically tied with a silver cord, might we already carry within us but lack the wisdom to truly appreciate their value? One has listened intently to how the winds carry their messages across unimaginable distances, pondering the gifts that require deep wisdom to be used correctly. Now let your mind shift to a more serene place, to a majestic palace overlooking a harbour, where the same woman has tirelessly watched for the return of the same ship for 20 long years. Imagine yourself in the women's quarters of this palace on the legendary island of Ithaca, where the morning light gently filters through tall windows facing the boundless sea. A subtle scent of wool and lavender hangs in the air, mingling with a particular silence that is an inherent part of long and intense waiting. And there, at her loom, sits the most patient woman in all mythology, Penelope, the faithful wife of Odysseus, the skilled weaver of a shroud that seemed destined never to be completed. 20 years. One needs only to reflect on this vast span of time for a moment. 20 years is long enough for a child to grow up and become a parent themselves. It is enough time for olive trees to reach maturity and bear their first fruits. This period is quite sufficient for even the most intimate details to fade from memory. The sound of someone's laughter, the habit of clearing one's throat in the mornings, or the peculiar way a person tied their sandals. But Penelope remembers absolutely everything. One observes her hands as she works at her loom and notices how they move with that almost automatic precision achieved only through decades of continuous practice. Thread over thread, thread under thread, the shuttle flies back and forth like a nimble swallow darting among thick reeds. Her fingers have mastered this movement so perfectly that she could probably continue weaving even in her sleep, and perhaps, sometimes, she does. Perhaps at times in the pre-dawn hours, when the world is still steeped in grey twilight, she finds herself standing at the loom, with no memory of leaving her bed, adding a few more inches to the burial shroud she is skillfully weaving for her esteemed father-in-law, Laertes. However, as for this shroud of Penelope's, it has been in a state of almost finished for 3 whole years. Almost finished, but never brought to completion. And there is a very good reason for this. A reason that makes one realize the profound depth of mind and cunning of this extraordinarily patient woman. The shroud is truly beautiful. This is evident even in its unfinished state. Along its border are skillfully woven scenes from Laertes' life, his wedding day, his valiant victories in battles, his first meeting with his son Odysseus, and his peaceful moments spent in the palace gardens. Penelope has poured 20 years of her memories and her unparalleled skill into this weaving, and it is reflected in every flawless stitch. This reason has very specific names, and they sound loud and insistent, filling the great hall of the palace every day from dawn to dusk. These are the suitors, 108 men who have convinced themselves that Odysseus will never return home, and that Penelope, therefore, needs a new husband, preferably one of them. For 3 years they have exerted constant pressure on Penelope, demanding that she choose a new husband, and for these 3 years she has invariably given them the same answer. I cannot remarry until I finish weaving this burial shroud for my dear father-in-law. It would be deeply disrespectful to begin a new life while this sacred duty remains unfulfilled. Their voices can be clearly heard even here, in the quiet women's quarters. They unceremoniously drink Odysseus's wine, feast on his cattle, and incessantly argue over which of them is most worthy to marry his wife and inherit his kingdom. They give the impression of a flock of predatory vultures who have decided to take up residence in the palace and steadfastly refuse to leave. Penelope's excuse sounds perfectly reasonable. It is exactly what a virtuous and beautiful daughter-in-law might say. The suitors, of course, grumble and complain, but they are powerless to dispute her words. After all, honouring the deceased is considered a sacred duty. Even these vultures understand that. What they do not understand, what they could not even imagine, is that every night, after the palace falls completely silent and the last heavily drinking suitor stumbles off to his makeshift bed in the courtyard, Penelope rises from her couch and returns to her loom. The observer watches her perform this act, and the sight is both heartbreaking and strikingly ingenious. Her fingers, which by day flitted with such speed and certainty at the loom, now move with an entirely different, methodical and painstaking precision, the precision of unravelling. She does not merely pull at threads haphazardly, no. She undoes her own work stitch by flawless stitch, carefully preserving the yarn so that it can be used again tomorrow. And so, every night, by the dim light of a lamp, in that deep silence that only accompanies women and their hidden secrets, she unravels everything that was created during the day. Thread by thread, stitch by stitch, she destroys what she painstakingly built in daylight. The shroud, which by sunset is almost complete, by dawn is once again a canvas requiring weeks of work. Thus passed 3 years. For 3 years, Penelope spent her days weaving and her nights unravelling, desperately buying time in the hope that somewhere out there, on the wine-dark sea, a familiar sail would finally turn towards home. But one must only consider the cost of these 3 years. It was both the physical exhaustion of work that essentially amounted to 2 full days for every day lived, and the inexhaustible stress of maintaining a deception, the exposure of which would mean inevitable disaster. Added to this was the deep psychological strain of creating something beautiful every day, only to ruthlessly destroy it every night. By the flickering lamplight it would have been so easy to make a mistake, pull too hard and break a thread, miss a loop and leave undeniable proof of her nightly activity. Yet Penelope never makes a mistake. This is a woman who has elevated deception to an art form and made patience her sharpest weapon. But in Penelope's very essence, there is something that refuses to accept a logical, rational conclusion. Perhaps it is an unyielding stubbornness. Perhaps it is boundless love. Or perhaps it is simply a deep, intuitive knowledge that some people are too important to give up on, even when it seems so much easier to surrender. 20 years is an incredibly long time to continue believing in someone's return. Long enough for even the most reasonable people to assume the worst. Long enough for even loving hearts to begin to heal, to accept a form of loss. The suitors are not entirely wrong when they point out the high probability of Odysseus's death, arguing that endlessly holding on to hope is impractical and even unhealthy. And beneath it all lies the profound exhaustion that inevitably comes from deferred hope. For even Penelope, with all her cunning and unyielding determination, must have moments when she questions whether she is weaving and unravelling for a man who may never come home. Or perhaps he had a special gift for listening to people that made everyone feel like the most important person in the world. This wasn't just about her, but about everyone around. Servants, farmers, even children. He would squat down to their eye level and ask questions as if their answers truly mattered to him. Sometimes, sitting with her in the evenings before she began her secret unravelling, one might hear her speak of her husband. Not the legendary hero Odysseus, not the king who fought at Troy, but the man she married when they were both young and naively believed they understood what life would bring them. He was always impatient with his sandals, she might say, her hands automatically continuing to move the shuttle. The leather straps never lay right, and he would mutter to himself as he adjusted them. Such a small thing, but I can still hear exactly how he sounded. These are not the stories bards tell of Odysseus. These are the memories that belong exclusively to wives, the small, intimate details that make a man irreplaceable. And as the observer listens to Penelope share them, they begin to understand why she continues to weave and unravel, why she refuses to believe that such a man could simply vanish from the world. The palace around her has changed in these 20 years of waiting. Telemachus, the child she breastfed when his father left for Troy, is now a man himself, tall and serious, bearing the burden of being his father's son in a kingdom full of men eager to take his parents' place. At times, one might see him standing in doorways with an expression mixed with frustration and admiration as he watches his mother work. He is torn between wanting to protect her from the increasingly aggressive demands of the suitors and a deep respect for her right to make her own choices. She is stronger than all of them combined, he might quietly say, but I worry how long even her strength can last. The household itself reflects the tension of these long years. Servants who remembered Odysseus remain fiercely loyal to Penelope. However, they are outnumbered by new servants who see the suitors as the future of the palace. The stores of food and wine, meant to last for years, are consumed at such a rate that the old housekeeper desperately shakes her head, and through it all, Penelope weaves day after day, creating something beautiful and meaningful, something worthy of the old man who will eventually need this shroud, but who deserves to have his son return home first. Her weaving becomes a prayer, woven of wool and hope, a physical manifestation of her refusal to let go. One of the maidservants, a young woman whose loyalty leaned toward the side that seemed most likely to prevail, began to observe more closely and eventually noticed something strange in the progress of the shroud, or rather, in the lack of progress. 3 years of daily weaving should have produced enough fabric to cover a giant, but Laertes' burial shroud never seemed to get closer to completion, and then one day she saw what she had been looking for, Penelope quietly returning to her loom late at night, the lamplight flickering on the walls as she unravelled her day's work. However, prayers, even when woven with perfect stitches, do not always bring the answers we want, and when we want them. And after 3 years of successful deception, Penelope's secret is revealed. The observer freezes looking at Penelope's face during this confrontation. And what is most striking is her incredible composure. She does not deny the deception. There is no point now. She does not apologize or make excuses. She simply stands by her loom, her hands resting on the frame she used to buy 3 precious years of hope, and looks at these men with such dignity that they shift uncomfortably, despite their anger. Enough of games, the loudest of them growls. You will choose a husband within a month, or we will choose one for you. The confrontation, when it comes, is as ugly as one might expect from men who have just realized they've been outsmarted by a woman they thought they were pressuring. The suitors burst into the women's quarters like a pack of angry dogs, shouting accusations and demands. But even in seeming capitulation, Penelope finds a way to exercise her cunning. The contest she proposes, to string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axes lined up, is theoretically possible for any skilled archer. But the bow in question is one that only Odysseus could ever string. A weapon so perfectly suited to his strength and technique that it might as well have been a part of his body. Very well, she finally says, I will choose. The suitors, of course, do not know this. They see the bow and assume it is merely a matter of muscle strength and practice. What they do not understand is that some things are made for only one person, and no amount of force or determination can change that fundamental truth. Perhaps it is a wedding veil for a marriage she hopes will never happen. Perhaps it is a sail for a ship she dreams will finally come home. Perhaps it is simply what occupies her hands while her heart prepares for joy or sorrow. The observer wants to tell her that heroes sometimes return, that 20 years of waiting are finally coming to an end, that the bow contest will have an outcome none of the suitors expect, but she cannot know that yet. All she can do is weave and hope, and believe that somewhere in the world, someone worthy of her patience is still fighting to come home. As the suitors prepare for this final contest, Penelope sits at her loom and begins to weave again. This time, not a burial shroud. That deception is over. Instead, she begins something new, something whose pattern only she can see. And perhaps this is the true lesson of Penelope's story. Not that waiting always pays off, or that faithful wives always get their happy endings, but that some kinds of love are strong enough to change the very flow of time. That sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to give up, thread by thread, stitch by stitch, day by day. Tonight, reflecting on the things worth waiting for in one's own life, one can almost hear the soft sound of the shuttle moving through the threads, counting time like a heartbeat, measuring hope in inches of carefully woven fabric. The reader might have pondered the patience required to wait 20 years for a loved one's return. How hope can be woven and unravelled like threads on a loom. Now, let the mind turn to the eastern horizon, where every morning begins anew, where a goddess with rosy fingers paints the sky in the same beautiful colours for thousands of years. All because one mortal man broke her immortal heart. Imagine yourself standing on a hill facing the sea, at that magical time before dawn, when the whole world holds its breath. The stars fade like candle flames in the growing light, and somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, Eos, the goddess of dawn, prepares for another day's work, harnessing her winged horses to her golden chariot, choosing which shades of pink, orange, and soft yellow she will spread across the sky. But today, as on every preceding day for countless millennia, she pauses before embarking on her eternal journey. Her gaze is fixed on earth, searching for what she will never find again. She remembers one who was destined to be immortal, but consciously chose the path of a beautiful, heartbreakingly human life. His name was Tithonus, and he was considered the most perfect of mortals ever to walk the earth. His beauty was not like the rugged handsomeness of warriors or the majesty of kings. He was beautiful like the morning itself, gentle, golden, and in some inexplicable way flawless, as if the gods, striving to create the ideal human, surpassed their own wildest expectations. Eos first saw him in his youth, standing in the gardens of Troy, illuminated by the first rays of dawn, and she fell so completely in love that for a moment she forgot her purpose, to bring the light of a new day to the world. Sailors awaiting the first glimmers of light felt a delay. Farmers preparing for the day's labours wondered why the sky remained dark. But Eos could only gaze upon this mortal youth, who seemed woven from condensed sunlight. The fact is, goddesses are not meant to fall in love with mortals. Such unions invariably end tragically, not just sadly, but cosmically, catastrophically bad. Mortals age and pass away, while goddesses remain eternally young. Mortals worry about harvests and battles, about whether their children will survive the winter, while gods think in terms of centuries and millennia. Yet love, even immortal love, does not obey decrees. Love simply exists, like dawn itself, arriving whether convenient or not. So Eos did what goddesses in love do. She descended from the heavens in her golden chariot and carried Tithonus away to her palace, located at the edge of the world, where the celestial dome meets the boundless ocean and every dawn is born. Can you imagine being abducted by the morning itself? Not carried away in darkness and fear, but uplifted in light and wonder. Carried across the morning sky by horses whose hooves sound like distant thunder, whose manes stream behind them like fiery roars. Tithonus might have been afraid. He might have begged to return to his mortal life, to his earthly concerns, to his limited lifespan. Instead, he looked at Eos, truly saw her with an attentiveness that penetrates through power and beauty, and fell in love in return. And oh, what a love it was! In her palace, woven of crystal, clouds, and eternal sunrise, they found complete happiness. Eos began each day by painting the sky for the world below, and Tithonus watched her work, learning the secret names of colours that do not exist in mortal language. That shade there, he might say, pointing to a particularly beautiful streak of rose gold. What do you call it? Hope touched with sorrow, she might reply, her brush trailing light as she swept it across the heavens. I use it in the mornings when someone below is about to receive news that will forever change their life. They had decades of such a life. He learned the art of creating dawn, and she discovered what it was like to be truly understood in her work. But decades flew by swiftly when one is happy, and eventually Eos noticed something that filled her immortal heart with a very earthly dread. Tithonus was aging, not quickly, not dramatically, just the gentle, inexorable aging that affects all mortals. A few wrinkles around his eyes when he smiled, hair still golden but with glints of silver, hands that were still gentle but with slight spots appearing with the years. He was still beautiful, always would be beautiful to her, but he was also unmistakably, heartbreakingly mortal. That night, as Tithonus slept peacefully in their bed of clouds and starlight, Eos made a decision that would haunt her forever. She flew to Olympus and cast herself at the feet of Zeus, king of the gods, begging for the only gift that could save her love from the fate awaiting all mortals. Make him immortal, she pleaded, tears of liquid dawn streaming down her face. I cannot bear to lose him to death. Grant him immortal life, and I will paint the most beautiful dawns the world has ever seen. Zeus, who understood both love and the complexities it causes, granted her request. With a single word, he bestowed upon Tithonus the gift of immortal life. But here's the thing about asking favours of the gods. You have to be very, very careful what exactly you ask for. And Eos, in her desperation and love, forgot to ask for the one thing that makes immortal life worthwhile. She asked for eternal life. She did not ask for eternal youth. Wait, do you see the terrible perfection of this oversight? Tithonus would live forever. Yes, but he would continue to age forever. He would age and age some more for all eternity, never dying, but never ceasing the slow slide into decrepitude and feebleness. At first, it didn't seem to matter. Tithonus aged slowly, gracefully, like a fine wine, gaining complexity with time. His hair turned completely grey, then white, but it was still beautiful in the dawn light. Wrinkles appeared on his face, but they were kind wrinkles, lines of laughter, the marks of decades of happiness. But decades turned into centuries, and centuries into millennia, and Tithonus kept aging. His back bent under the weight of unthinkable years. His hands trembled with a palsy that no medicine could cure, because it was not a disease. It was simply the accumulated weariness of too much time. His voice, once clear and sweet as a morning bird's song, became a whisper, then a rasp, then something barely human. His eyes, which once saw wonder in every sunrise, clouded with cataracts that would never heal, because healing requires the possibility of death and renewal. And through it all, Eos loved him. She painted him the most beautiful dawn she could imagine, brought him nectar and ambrosia, sang him songs that only goddesses know. But love, however pure and strong, cannot undo a gift given by the king of the gods. Eventually, though, eventually is a strange word when speaking of eternity, Tithonus became so old, so frail, so worn under the weight of endless years that he was barely recognizable as the golden youth Eos had fallen in love with. Some stories say that she finally mercifully transformed him into a grasshopper, a creature whose voice is but a whisper in the grass, whose life is tied to the cycle of days and seasons, who speaks in a language of small, persistent sounds that most people don't even notice. Other stories say he simply faded away, becoming one with the dawn itself. His voice is now the sound light makes as it touches the world. His presence is the reason why sunrises are both beautiful and sad. But every morning as Eos harnesses her horses to her chariot and prepares to bring light to the world, she remembers. She remembers what it is like to love someone completely, to want to keep that love forever, to discover that some gifts are too dangerous to ask for and too precious to refuse. And perhaps this is why dawn is the most melancholic time of day. Beautiful. Yes, breathtakingly, unbearably beautiful, but touched with sadness, with the knowledge that all beautiful things are temporary, that love and light and life itself become precious precisely because they do not last forever. You watch today's sunrise and feel it, the way that light hovers for just a moment before fully appearing, as if Eos is still looking at the world below, still hoping for a glimpse of something golden and perfect, and irrevocably lost. The colours she paints across the sky are now more complex than they were in those first happy decades with Tithonus. Rose gold touched with grief, pink streaked with longing, orange holding the memory of laughter, yellow bearing the weight of regret. She has become a master of her art through suffering, creating beauty that speaks to everyone who has ever loved something they couldn't hold, who has ever made a wish they couldn't unmake, who has ever learned that sometimes getting exactly what you ask for is the cruelest gift of all. And yet she continues to paint the sky morning after morning, age after age, not because she must. Gods are rarely bound by mere beauty, but because beauty is still worth creating, even if it is born from a broken heart, especially when it is born from a broken heart. Every sunrise is a love letter to a world that contains both wonder and loss, both joy and sorrow. To mortals who live short, bright lives, and to immortals who must remember them forever. She paints hope through the darkness not because she believes everything will be perfect, but because hope itself is beautiful, regardless of the outcome. In her palace, at the edge of the world, surrounded by the tools of her craft, brushes made of comet tails, paints mixed from the essence of stars, a palette holding every shade of light that has ever existed, she continues her eternal work. Sometimes, especially in those divine morning hours when the sunlight seems to radiate an extraordinary warmth, and nature's colours merge in astonishing perfection, one might catch something special in the diverse chorus of birds and insects. This voice is so barely discernible that it could be mistaken for a figment of imagination, and so ancient that it might be the very breath of time, whispering words in a language that precedes all human speech. Perhaps it is Tithonus, still there in some transformed guise, still perceiving wonder in the daily phenomenon of light dispelling darkness. He still harbours love for the goddess who saved him from demise, but could not save him from the burden of existing too long. He is still grateful, despite everything, for the invaluable gift of witnessing 10,000 years of sunrises painted by immortal hands. Or perhaps it is simply a gentle breeze, gliding through the grass. That is the sound light makes when it first touches the world. It is the voice that hope makes, awakening every morning, regardless of what yesterday brought or what tomorrow promises. As one drifts off to sleep, carried into the world of dreams by the memory of gentle, rosy-fingered hands painting the celestial dome with wondrous colours, one might ponder the gifts they would ask for if given the chance to make any wish. And then, like Eos in ancient times, they may realize that the most essential component of any cherished wish is not a list of what to include, but rather the ability to remember what space to leave free. For sometimes the most marvelous phenomena, such as a sunrise, profound love, or the touching stories that lull us to sleep, achieve their perfection. This happens precisely because they are fleeting. They are precious because they cannot be held forever. They are significant precisely because they should be experienced every moment with genuine gratitude and deep wonder, and with that special attentiveness born from the understanding, this particular ray of light, this particular morning, this particular story will never be exactly the same again.